Hello, historians. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the end of the Vietnam War and some other things that were occurring at the end of the Vietnam War. The president that wins the 1968 election, as we talked about in the last one, was Richard Nixon. He had been the vice president during the 1950s. Then he loses to Kennedy in 1960 for the presidency, but he runs again 8 years later and defeats Hubert Humphrey. So he's going to be the president at the end of the Vietnam War that brings our troops home. He doesn't bring them home right away. I would have had us listening to this song. I'll have a link to it, but CCR's Fortunate Son, which would have been one of the Vietnam protest songs we were talking about. This is Dwight Eisenhower's grandson, Dwight David Eisenhower. If you've ever heard of Camp David, it is named after him. And then this was Richard Nixon's daughter. And so Eisenhower's grandson and Nixon's daughter got married, and the CCR song Fortunate Son that you've heard of. Some folks are born made to wave the flag, ooh, the red, white, and blue. And when the band plays Hail to the Chief, ooh, they point the cannon at you, Lord. It ain't me, it ain't me. I ain't no senator's son. Son, it ain't me, it ain't me. I ain't no fortunate one. No. Some folks are born with the silver spoon in hand. Lord, don't they help themselves? Oh, but when the taxman comes to the door, Lord, the house looks like a rummage sale, yes. So anyway, when he's singing this song, it's not about these two, but that was something that was going on while he was writing it. And he's saying, hey, the average person is going to Vietnam. It seems like a lot of these rich politicians' kids, they're not having to go to Vietnam. And so that was part of how he wrote that song. And you hear it around the 4th of July and stuff all the time. So 1968, Nixon is winning the election. That same year, Martin Luther King Jr. is killed, and then Robert Kennedy, who was also running for president, was shot and killed. That was the younger brother of JFK. So two important people in the country at the time are killed and assassinated. As far as Cold War things going on, 1968, Prague Spring, as you have the Czech people in Czechoslovakia basically trying to revolt and remove their communist government. And the Soviet Union sends troops and tanks in to Prague and into the Czechoslovakia to support the Czech communist government. And so this is kind of the second time in maybe the last 10 years with Hungary in 56 and then in 68 Prague Spring, where you have some people in communist countries that don't want to be communist and the military is stomping it down. You'll see a famous NHL player, Jaromir Jagr, played for lots of teams in the NHL. He played for from 1990 to 2015 or 14 or something like that. He always wore 68, and you think, well, why was he wearing 68? That's an odd number. Well, he's from the Czech Republic. When he started playing hockey, he had to leave Czechoslovakia right as the Cold War is ending as a young kid. So he wears that because of the Prague Spring in 68. We talked about Walter Cronkite basically saying the U.S. should leave the Vietnam, and that's when LBJ is basically saying, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the average American. Nixon wins. In 1969, Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the revolution and leader of North Vietnam, dies at age 79, but the fighting continues. And in 1969, JFK's promise of beating the Soviets to the moon occurs, and Apollo 11 lands on the moon July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, first two human beings to walk on the moon. And we win the space race. Now in Vietnam, there's a new plan. Nixon's calling it Vietnamization. And basically, this is going to be transferring all the military responsibilities from American troops to the South Vietnamese troops is going to be the plan. So the goal is for our troops to leave Vietnam with honor. A little political cartoon. The strategy of seek and destroy is now changed to Vietnamization. Nixon makes Henry Kissinger his national security advisor and Secretary of State, and he will be Secretary of State under both Nixon and Gerald Ford. And he comes up with a plan called détente. And this is the easing of political tensions between the United States and the USSR. So the idea, instead of brinkmanship, going to the brink, instead of total annihilation, now it's okay, let's give peace a chance. You can see here time testing détente. Now at the same time, they're thinking, okay, how can we stop the North Vietnamese from bringing supplies into South Vietnam? And so they start bombing Cambodia and Laos. Now this was a top secret mission and was kept secret from everybody for years and years and years because we didn't have any right to bomb Laos or Cambodia. They were two neutral countries. And so we start bombing them, and the problem with this is it killed a lot of innocent civilians, anywhere between 150,000 and 500,000. And this is kept secret from the American people. When it came to fruition that this was happening, there was a protest at Kent State in Ohio, so at a college. And the protesters, the National Guard was in there, and the protesters must have spooked them, and they got worried, and that the National Guard fires off 67 rounds into the protesters. It lasts about 13 seconds, and it kills 4 students and wounds 9 others. And we'll have a song by Crosby, Stills, and Nash about that they wrote in the early 70s. Also, what comes out at this time are the Pentagon Papers. And this is when the New York Times and Washington Post are going to publish information revealing a legacy of deception in Vietnam from both the military and the executive branch. And this basically, the stuff that they have spans from Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson to Nixon, and doesn't make any of those presidents look good, both Republicans and Democrats. And at this point, this is, that the New York Times and Washington Post had to win. They had to win like a court case to make this legal, because some of the reporters and journalists could have been thrown in jail. Luckily, they won First Amendment rights, freedom of the press, and they were able to publish these top secret papers showing that our government's been lying to us. And American people were shocked that our government would lie to us for over 3 decades. They couldn't believe it. They made a movie about this recently called The Post. You've got Tom Hanks in it. There it is, The Post. Another big Cold War event, Nixon visits China in 1972. So kind of goes along with détente, trying to ease tensions, open up trade. Remember, even though we consider their government to be our enemy, there's 1.4 billion people in China today, and we view them as 1.4 billion customers that we can sell stuff to. Another part of détente that Kissinger helps achieve is the anti-ballistic missile treaty, where we would start having less missiles, and so would the Soviet Union. And you can see our troops start to decrease in Vietnam. We're up over 500,000 in 1969, and it's not that Nixon starts bringing them home immediately, but they start decreasing. And by 1972, we're down to about 184,000. The Christmas bombings, called Operation Linebacker 2, we bombed the heck out of some North Vietnam cities, Hanoi and Haiphong. B-52's bombing, we killed over 1,600 civilians. And by 1973, we sign a peace treaty with the Vietnamese, and we bring pretty much all of our troops home after this by 73. So you start thinking, okay, it really escalates in 64, but by 74 they're coming home. So between escalation and coming home was about 10 years, and it ends the U.S. involvement in the war. There's still a North and South Vietnam at this point. This is an iconic photograph of a prisoner of war coming home to his family. Some other things that are about to happen. Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, is forced to resign in 73 for taking bribes and kickbacks. And then this is not something that everybody really knew about in 72, or they do a little bit, but you had burglars break into the Democratic National Committee located in the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. And people knew about it, but they didn't know the extent of it in 72, who was all involved. And over time, what comes up is Nixon ordered those people to break in and try to steal evidence and try to find out information about his competitors. And so now this is a impeachable, impeachable thing that pops up. And in 74, when his role in Watergate comes to light, Nixon is forced to resign. So he does not get impeached. They truly believe, most people feel, he would have been impeached and removed from office, the only president to ever get removed from office. However, it didn't happen. So we've had 3 presidents impeached in the history of the United States. All right, it's recently been in the news with President Trump. President Clinton was impeached, and President Andrew Johnson back in the 1860s was impeached. However, no president has ever been removed from office. Nixon resigned. He probably would have been removed from office. His vice president, Gerald Ford, becomes president. And when Gerald Ford is president, North Vietnam invades South Vietnam and takes it over, and now there's just one Vietnam. So the fall of Saigon, which the North Vietnamese will rename Ho Chi Minh City, and North and South Vietnam unite. Here you have people fleeing, getting on helicopters and flying out of there. And so some people say, boy, we fought to stop the spread of communism into South Vietnam, and it did not happen. However, the domino effect, the neighboring countries never become communist. So in that regard, you could say it was successful. In the song by Billy Joel, Goodnight Saigon, he sings about how there was no home front. When soldiers returned home, they were not treated as heroes. It was not like World War II. And the soldiers, most of them, 99.9% of them, did nothing wrong, followed orders, and they weren't treated as heroes. People were spitting on them, treating them terribly. So it's very sad that our soldiers that fought and people that died for our country were not treated very well. And some of that comes from the things like My Lai that came out, but 99.9% of them were just doing their job. Many veterans were labeled baby killers. You had a lot of veterans that came home with post-traumatic stress disorder, got addicted to drugs and alcohol. If you've seen the first Rambo movie from a long time ago, he was a Vietnam War vet who was being hassled by some cops in a town. So then he fights back against them. In the end, there were over 3.3 million Americans who served in Vietnam. Over 58,000, almost 59,000 were killed. Over 303,000 were wounded. There were 838 prisoners, Americans taken prisoner, and there were over 2,477 that are still classified as missing. If you go to Washington, D.C., you can see the Vietnam Veteran Memorial that has every name, as all over 58,000 names of all these men that were killed in Vietnam. So you can go there and look at it. 238 Americans were awarded the Medal of Honor. There's 2.7 million veterans still alive. Vietnam veterans are receiving roughly $500,000, all of them together, a year from the government. Direct American expenditures for the war is at $165 billion and counting.